Chapter 27, Chapter 27. Chapter 27, A Flicker of the Past. Ash! Janine yelped, squeezing her hands tight and clutching at the young man's waist. Go slow please. A quick and heavy breath cut her short as her whole frame shook. I've never done this before. She squeezed her eyes closed so tightly it hurt, her head already fuzzy with the rush of sensations as the rest of her body throbbed and ached. Ash couldn't hold back a small grin, his blood pulsing with the thrill he had missed for some time. Every breath he took pushed the stress of the previous weeks farther from his mind. He steadied himself and patted Janine's knee. Come on now, he said. Open your eyes. You're going to have to get used to this. Hesitantly cracking one eye open, Janine lifted her face from Ash's back and looked out over the tops of the clouds, so close she could have reached down from Pidgeot's back and touched them. The cold wind blew hard in her face, whipping her hair all around and making it impossible to see clearly. The sting of the dry air bit into her knuckles and again the girl closed her eyes. How long do we have to do this? She asked, burying her face Ash's back and squeezing him even tighter. Until you can ride on your own, Ash shouted over the wind, looking back at his passenger and guiding Pidgeot with his knees to bank gently left and towards the ground. Now open your eyes. It's completely safe. A second time, Janine opened just one eye, but this time watched as the clouds slowly rose up over her. You promised I wouldn't fall off. She shouted, barely able to hear herself over her heart. Ash smirked. And you won't. You're strapped in tight as can be. Glancing at her legs, Janine mentally assessed the straps holding her in the saddle, trying to determine whether or not they were strong enough to hold her in the event of a sudden updraft or change in direction. Then she remembered that the saddle only had one set of straps, and that she wore them. You're not tied in! The girl shrieked, wrapping her arms around Ash's chest and grabbing onto his collar with both hands. Ash laughed for a second, his whole body feeling light as a broad smile overtook his features. With a grip like yours, he chuckled, aiming Pidgeot towards the ground at a gentle angle, I don't think it matters. Wings flapping open to bring her to an easy stop a few dozen feet above the ground, Pidgeot dropped to the grassy field outside Saffron and trotted to a stop. Her crest floating out beside her in the breeze, the massive bird stooped a little as Ash jumped down from her back. The trainer nimbly undid the restraints holding Janine in the saddle and offered her a hand down. Ash Ketchum, said the girl, obviously trying to look angry but unable not to grin as she took his hand and stepped to the ground on wobbling legs, you're horrible. Pausing for just a second, Ash took a deep breath. Maybe just a little, he said with a grin, well aware that he had yet to let go of Janine's hand. Good job though, for your first time flying I mean. We'll have you riding solo before you know it. Blushing, the girl in the hoodie looked away and across the small clearing. Sitting lazily under a tree, Arcanine looked up and between the pair of humans, then glanced over his shoulder to Ounce. Just inside the tree line, Ash's Munchlax had some time ago set to work devouring the undergrowth and any small animals he found hiding low in the trees. Already the ravenous Pokémon had cleared an area the size of a small barn of any plant life taller than grass and stripped the low-hanging branches of any bugs or birds' nests. Is it just me, Janine nodded to the Munchlax, or has he gotten bigger in the last day or two? Probably, yeah, Ash shrugged. He's definitely bigger than he was at Sylph. The young trainer grinned. Actually, now that you mention it, he's a good 2 or 3 inches taller. One ear perking up a little, Ounce turned and looked over its shoulder at the two trainers. The Pokémon stared at them for a second, before its stomach growled, prompting him to return to feasting on the undergrowth. Knowing Arcanine kept a vigilant watch, Ash sighed and sat down, leaning against Pidgeot as the massive bird nested down in the grass. I remember days like this back on the frontier. Ash took a deep breath and glanced up at the lightly clouded sky, quiet, laid back. He stretched his legs out on the grass as Pidgeot cooed behind him. There was this little forest just outside Pallet. My mom would always tell me not to go there because of the wild Pokémon. He smirked. And of course I'd always sneak out anyway, since there was a little pond where Grandpa would take Aisha and I swimming, and I liked to have it to myself. Those were good times. Sitting in the grass beside him, Janine stretched out and scanned the perimeter of the clearing. So you were suicidal even before I met you? A proper lunatic, said Ash. I was always getting into trouble. One time I just about got my arm taken off by a Rattata because I was exploring Route 1 and walked right into its nest. I'd have been dinner if my grandpa hadn't seen me sneak out and decided to follow me. So. He turned to Janine, what was it like growing up in a gym? What do you mean? Asked the girl, looking over and up at him. Well, you had to know you would be taking over the gym from your dad one day, said Ash. How did you handle that kind of responsibility? Hesitating for a second, Janine looked straight ahead. It never seemed to matter too much. There weren't too many kids in the gym when I was little, and we spent most of our time learning from the adults anyway, so it never came up. She paused, slumped to her right, and dropped her head onto Ash's shoulder. 6 hours every day in homeschool, 6 more in physical training, 2 in combat training, she said when Ash didn't shrug away. Add in 8 for sleeping, and that didn't leave much time for anything like a social life. That sounds rough, Ash muttered. It was all we knew, Janine shrugged. And it was fun in its own way. At least until my mother got sick. After she passed. She took a breath. Koga started pulling farther away until he was hardly at the gym at all and communicated almost exclusively through messages. I guess now I know why. How do you think they're doing back there? Asked Ash. The gym. Janine blinked. Yeah, said the other trainer, absent-mindedly watching Ounce munch on a low-hanging tree limb. Janine sighed. They've got their orders, she said. But I think I'm going to send Vicky back anyway. Keep honest people honest. Honest ninjas. Ash smirked. Hey, sneaky doesn't mean dishonest, you jerk, said the girl in the hoodie. I've been pretty straightforward with you. True, Ash mumbled. He started standing, giving Janine enough time to move her head before he got to his feet. Come on, he said, offering her a hand up. Break's over, time to fly. Janine gulped, but accepted the hand up. Twice more that afternoon the two trainers took to the sky, each time going a little higher and remaining aloft a little longer before returning to the ground. On each break the trainers saw that Ounce had begun clearing away sections of the forest at an accelerated rate, leading both to speculate that the Pokémon might be growing into a Snorlax right before their eyes. Janine expressed no small amount of concern at the idea, but the notion further added to Ash's growing satisfaction with the day. By the time they began breaking down their rudimentary camp, the sun had dipped almost to the horizon and settled behind the stark skyline of Saffron City. In places, plumes of smoke from the fires caused by the massive electrical storm 2 days prior still rose into the sky. Strapping Janine into Pidgeot's saddle and climbing up behind her, Ash returned Arcanine and the Munchlax to their Pokeballs before tapping the bird with his heels. Pidgeot's wings snapped open and downwards and she and her passengers shot up into the orange sky. How do you get used to that? Janine huffed once the turning in her stomach had settled. You learn to love it, said the other trainer holding the bird's stubby reins and angling her towards the city. My God! Ash muttered a moment later. Look at that! Janine looked down just as they flew over the massive wall separating the inner and outer rings of Saffron. She couldn't help but stare as she caught sight of the enormous groups of people gathered around the inner city's main gate. Standing in the barricaded passage were a dozen or so people in white Team Rocket uniforms, each accepting armfuls of water bottles from a supply train men with boxes of the bottles, and turning to distribute them amongst the crowd of people. Several figures in lavender robes stood atop the wall watching over the proceedings. I guess no power means no running water, said Ash, thinking back to his conversation with Sabrina. Or much of anything else, Janine added, seeing the Team Rocket members below breaking out bags of rice. I wonder how much of a stockpile Sabrina has to fall back on. As the crowd pressed closer and closer to the gate, the clusters of people growing so dense as to completely block any view of the ground, Ash and Janine heard someone scream. The sound carried on the wind, immediately followed by a surge of the crowd towards the gate and a cacophonous roar of voices as a fight between the mob and the Team Rocket relief workers. One of the psychics on the wall raised a hand towards the sky and a bolt of purple lightning arced from his fingers high into the air with a clap of thunder. Screams continued to echo in the crowd, though now the people began running away from the gate as Team Rocket's workers began retreating with the supplies. What was that all about? Asked Janine. Ash shrugged. I'm sure Sabrina will know, he said. The girl in the hoodie didn't answer, instead just leaning back a little, resting against Ash, and trying to get used to being so high in the air. The pair of trainers began banking steadily downwards and angling towards the roof of the Saffron Gym, the air warming noticeably as they descended and landed on the concrete structure's roof. Ash dismounted and undid the straps around Janine's legs, helping her down from the bird as the utility door to the roof opened with a click. Turning and spotting Sabrina stepping out onto the roof, Ash and Janine relaxed a little. I saw you coming, said the psychic, smiling a little, though her features seemed strained as she glanced past Ash and out over Saffron. Do you both have a moment? Ash and Janine glanced at one another before Ash turned back to Sabrina. Sure, he said. If you don't mind putting up with us, then I don't think we were planning on leaving until tomorrow morning anyway. Good, said Sabrina, turning about and reaching up to keep her hair out of her face as a gust of wind blew over the roof. I want you both well rested. Also, I have something for you. Clearing his throat as he followed Sabrina down from the roof and into the stairwell beyond the utility door, Ash dropped one hand into his pocket. So your people are working with Team Rocket, he said, descending the stairs. Yes, said the psychic, tone flat. We've been working in close cooperation, trying to get the power back up and running. And how's that going? Asked Ash. Stopping on a landing, Sabrina stood next to one of the gym's heavy metal doors. A spark of purple leapt between her fingers and the handle and the door slid silently open. The power surge, to say nothing of the storm, Zapdos caused when it escaped dealt considerable damage to a lot of vital infrastructure. The psychic's countenance fell a little farther as Ash and Janine reached the landing and walked through the door. The necessary repairs won't come quickly or easily. I'll send a letter to Bailey, back in Vermilion, said Ash. It wouldn't take much for him to get a crew up here to help with the repairs if you could send him an escort. It's not like we're hurting for supplies down there. Sabrina nodded and followed the other trainers into the bunker beneath the gym, her shiny red uniform catching the emergency lighting and flickering. I would appreciate that very much, she said, and I'll see about getting Lorenzo to put a team together as soon as we can spare the men. For now though. She paused and stepped into the bunker's central control room where a few of the other psychics stood around the chamber's main table, looking at computer screens and chatting into headsets or fiddling with ham radios. I took the liberty, said Sabrina, snapping her fingers, and instantly bringing every eye in the room to herself, of having some of our less available products brought out for you. She stopped for just a second as one of the other psychics nodded and walked quickly from the room after removing his headset. It's common knowledge that Saffron has long been the region's leading producer of technical textiles and industrial composites, but not too many people know the full extent of what we've learned to do with materials ranging from simple as fiberglass to more advanced carbon fiber sheets. Ash and Janine turned to the side as the psychic, Lorenzo, Ash noticed, in the lavender robe returned. Pulling behind him a dolly laden with a pair of plain brown boxes, he stopped in front of them. With seemingly very little effort, given the container's sizes, the man set the boxes on the floor. He slid a glowing purple finger along the tape lining the top of one box and instantly the tape split as though it had been cut by a razor. Here we go, said Sabrina, walking forward and pulling the box open, motioning for Ash and Janine to come closer as her subordinate stepped aside. Have a look. Ash stooped over the box, reached inside, and with one hand pulled out a thick black helmet. Body armor? He asked, looking back into the box and spotting the inky breastplate and pauldrons resting on top of other protective components. We call it thermal armor, Mark 51 Beta, Sabrina said, an unmistakable air of pride in her tone, or T51B, for short. The pressed fiberglass exoskeleton can easily withstand temperatures of 700 degrees and won't soften up until subjected to more than 1500 degrees, while the carbon fiber reinforced underlay can resist as much as 25 kilojoules of kinetic impact without adding unnecessary weight. She smirked. Even a Charizard would have trouble tearing through this. There's one suit for each of you, and they should be roughly your sizes. Sabrina looked between Ash and Janine. Opening up the other box, Janine's eyes went a little wide when she picked up the helmet. It's so light, she muttered. The heaviest component is actually the glass eyepiece in the helmet, said Sabrina. The rest was engineered with weight in mind. Once you get it all on properly, walking around in a volcano's as easy as strolling through a park. Ash lowered the breastplate a little and glanced at Sabrina. Why would anyone need to walk around in a volcano? He asked. Who buys this? Well, Cinnabar's special forces are very fond of them, Sabrina smiled. Apparently, the protection-to-weight ratio works wonderfully for flying trainers and the insulative properties give the wearer a marked advantage over Pokémon with fire or electrical attacks. I thought, since you were headed to Cinnabar, that you might as well be dressed for it. You'll also find the marsh badge in an envelope, Ash. She pointed to the box. Stopping for a second, Ash stared into the box and at the little paper envelope. Sabrina, he muttered, trying to keep his voice low enough to avoid the attention of the other psychics standing around the chamber's central table, there's something that's been bugging me all day, but I'm not completely sure how to ask about it without being, well, more than a little rude. Her expression shifting quickly between amused curiosity and a more serious interest, Sabrina took a few steps closer. She glanced over her shoulder at the other psychics, namely Lorenzo, who had since gone back to chatting into his headset. Her vibrant purple eye glowing just a little brighter for an instant before fading to its normal brightness, Sabrina turned back to Ash and crossed her arms as Janine felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up a little. "You won't offend me," Sabrina said, speaking up a little to overcome the noise made by the bunker's generator growing louder. "What's on your mind?" Ash took a breath and dropped his hands into his pockets. "I don't get it," he said. "You've got to know that I'm planning on taking Team Rocket apart by whatever means I can, but even knowing that, you continue to work with them and give me all the support you can muster? Why? It's counterproductive." A wry grin tugged at Sabrina's lip. "You don't understand," she said. "I am on no one's side but my own, and I am Saffron." The psychic's tone grew grave, despite her expression. "Team Rocket helps me protect and care for my city, as do you. Therefore, to me, there's no difference between you and them, and I won't do for one anything I wouldn't do for the other." "But that's not true." Ash tried to interrupt. "We're completely—" "So, if you and Team Rocket are fated to destroy one another," Sabrina cut him off, "tragic as that might be, I won't stop either of you. Neither will I withhold my aid, however. It wouldn't be—" She stopped as though searching for a word. "Fair, to either one." "Fair," Ash muttered. "That's it then? It wouldn't be fair for you to stop someone who's completely screwing up the world." "They're not mucking up my world," said Sabrina. "Though I can understand why you might blame them for what happened to yours. If your position and theirs were reversed, however, I don't doubt that any member of Team Rocket would see it as highly unjust that I help you either." She nodded to him. "I'm not going to argue about this," he groaned, folding his arms across his chest and trying not to let himself become cynical. "Thank you for the armor," he said. "You're welcome," the psychic smiled a little to him and inclined her head politely to Janine. "Humble gifts given what you did for me, but I hope you're both well served by them. Now, I should be getting to a meeting with the Rosenberg family across town to discuss how Saffron should proceed." "Hey," said Janine, looking about the room. "Has anyone seen Vicky?" Sabrina smirked and cleared her throat once as she turned and began walking from the bunker. "She has been availing herself of my hospitality." No sooner had Sabrina finished, than a door down the hallway from the bunker's main chamber opened. Out walked Vicky and one of the psychics, a taller man with wide shoulders and curly hair tucked under his lavender hood. Janine raised an eyebrow as Vicky and the psychic parted ways at the door, neither speaking to the other. While the redhead crossed the room and waved to Janine and Ash, the taller man in the robe stepped up next to the table and one of Sabrina's other subordinates. "Hey guys," Vicky said casually, walking up to the other trainers with a blush lingering on her cheeks. "What's up? Have fun?" asked Janine, spotting the two male psychics at the table fist bumping. "Sure did," Vicky winked and elbowed the other girl. "It really is true what they about psychics." She held her hands in a circle and whispered to Ash. "Big as a flipping eggplant." "Oh God." Ash's face melted into horror as he turned for the door. "I can't know that." Janine turned with a venomous glare to the redhead as Ash left the room. "What the hell was that?" she hissed as Ash walked off. "What?" Vicky straightened out her wrinkled shirt, an intentionally dumb smile on her face. "Go on." "Ash," Janine whirled out the door. "Hold on a second." Vicky stood there a moment longer, her eyes narrowing and her lips curving into a feline grin. "Vicky, 2. Janine, 0, she whispered, turning around a second later and beginning to whistle. Giving the heavy buckles a final tug and tightening the leather straps holding Janine in Pidgeot's saddle, Ash ran one final check on the mount and her rider. Satisfied with Janine's job at securing herself to the massive bird, Ash stepped back and patted Pidgeot's neck. "Not bad," he said. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you were ready to take off." Janine straightened up in the saddle, a satisfied grin on her lips as her new armor caught the sunlight. "Told you," she said proudly. "Flying's already second nature, or at least it would be if it weren't so hard." "Sure thing, you'll get the hang of it," Ash muttered, shifting around, still adjusting to the uncanny ease with which he could move, even encased as he was by Sabrina's armor. Ash crossed the roof of Saffron's gym to meet one more time with the head psychic. He stopped in front Sabrina, extending his hand and shaking hers. Clearing her throat, Sabrina looked between the two trainers. "Will you be heading to Pewter then, Nodding, Ash tried to put his hands in his pockets, only to remember the armor lacked any such features. Yes. From there, I'll head to Pallet and then Cinnabar City and look for this Captain Zivika character. Thanks again for all your help. Ash went on, stepping back a little as a cool wind blew up and over the roof. And thank you for yours, said Sabrina, wiping one strand of hair away from her face and folding her hands behind her back. If you ever need anything else, I'd be happy to help. Likewise, said the young trainer from Pallet. He turned back towards Janine and took a step, before pausing to look over his shoulder, back at Sabrina. Good luck, he said, grabbing a Pokéball from his belt and tossing it to the ground. As Charizard coalesced from the spray of white light, Sabrina nodded. Same to you. Take care of yourself, Ketchum. She sighed. Her eyes flitting to Janine, who sat with Pidgeot's reins in hand. Sabrina smiled just a little wider than before as her red eye sparked with an almost imperceptibly faint glow. Ash stepped up to Charizard, putting his hand on the monstrous dragon's neck before swinging one leg over the Pokémon's back and pulling himself up into the saddle. With a final nod to Sabrina, Ash tapped Charizard's sides with his heels. Grunting and hissing out a line of smoke, Charizard's jaw clenched and his muscles bulged as he leapt into the air, snapped his wings open, and heaved downwards to carry himself aloft. Following Charizard's lead more than Janine's instruction, Pidgeot hopped forward and jumped from the roof of the gym, opening her wings and banking to glide above the street before flapping hard enough to move skywards and come up alongside Ash and Charizard. The massive bird tilted her wings and began flying steadily 10 meters to Charizard's left as Janine reached into the bag by her leg, drew out a thin radio, and fixed the earpiece such that she could quickly don her helmet without knocking it away. Hearing this, she said into the mic at her lip, pressing a button on the headset. Loud and clear, Ash answered a second later. How you holding up? As the two flying Pokémon shifted their course west and slightly north, gaining enough altitude to clearly make out the layout of Saffron City, the pair of passengers both took a last look at the walled metropolis and its outer slums. Not bad, said the girl. I'm still not too sure about being up so high for so long. Oh, Ash exclaimed. That reminds me. I should probably strap myself in, he said, reaching to his legs as though he were going to adjust the saddle's restraints. Ash. Janine jerked to look at him. What do you mean you're not? She stopped, seeing upon a closer look that the leather straps held Ash securely in place and that he only fiddles with the slack. Kidding, kidding, Ash's laugh came over the radio. I'm not quite that dumb. Ash Ketchum. Janine sighed. You've got to quit that. Sorry, said the other trainer. I'll quit, I promise. Flying just under the clouds, Ash and Janine went quiet as their mounts carried them over the gradually changing terrain. Less than 5 hours into the journey, Janine spotted and pointed out the distant structures of Celadon to their left. Even with his keen vision, it took Ash a moment to spot the city, and several minutes more to convince himself that flying could really make for such a quick journey. I flew around all the time in Vermilion, Ash told his traveling companion, and I knew it was faster than walking, but I guess I never really knew by how much. I'm not going to complain, said the girl. Why don't more people travel like this? I'd say, said Ash, that anyone who has the means and the need, already flies wherever they want, Several more hours rolled by and gradually the steep and sudden hills gave way to more level stretches of forest. More than once Ash drew out the compass Sabrina had given him and checked their course, a task not made easy by the jostling nature of flying. By the time the sun began to set, the two trainers had gone far enough in the direction noted by the compass that both felt they should be very near pewter. Low clouds flowing in from the north made flying high enough to survey the ground difficult however, and after another hour had passed, both Ash and Janine were forced to land and bunker down in a small copse of trees for the night as the air filled with the muddy smell of a coming storm. Returning a winded Pidgeot and a griping Charizard to their Pokéballs, Ash raised one arm to shield his face as a gust of wind accompanied by a wave of rain clapped down on his from the darkness overhead. Really? Muttered the trainer, the precipitation already flowing through the neck of his armor and beginning to fill up the protective shell like a bottle. Glancing around the little grove for Janine, barely able to see anything farther than an arm's length away, Ash spotted the girl kneeling on the grass and digging through her pack. What are you looking for? He asked, stepping up beside her. Pulling a tarp out from the bottom of the bag and spilling some of the other contents in the process, Janine held up the large piece of plastic and let it partially unfurl. Just think of it as a supersized poncho, said the girl, unrolling the tarp and holding up one end while motioning for Ash to come under it. Working from underneath the sheet of heavy plastic, with no small amount of trouble from the wind and rain, the two trainers managed to build a crude lean-to using Janine's tarp and the rope Ash had stored away in his backpack. Once finished, the trainers huddled under the structure on the unused and folded under portion of the tarp, facing away from the wind and rain. "Hold on a sec," Ash said as Janine began pulling off her armor. He reached for his belt, grabbed a Pokeball and snapped it open, releasing Arcanine into the rough shelter. The massive canine jerked in surprise at its surroundings, but calmed instantly upon seeing Ash. Arcanine met his trainer's eye for a split second and, without being ordered, hunkered down and began shifting around the lean-to, absorbing most of the moisture lingering on the tarp floor with his fur. Janine couldn't help but grin at the display as Arcanine finished drying the floor and, happily wagging his tail, settled up next to Ash. "He really does love you," said Janine, sidling up beside Ash and leaning her back against Arcanine, a gesture to which the canine began wagging his tail a little faster. "I know," said Ash, turning and running his hand through Arcanine's big mane. "Now that Pikachu's gone," the trainer said, his tone even, "Arcanine's my oldest Pokémon." "It shows," said the girl. Pausing for a second and staring off into the dark as the surround grew dimmer by the minute, Janine took a deep breath and began pulling off her boots and gauntlets. After a little while the girl in the hoodie could wave her hand in front of her face without seeing it. The only sounds were the rain, Arcanine's relaxed breathing, and the sound of Ash pouring water out of his boot. "At least we know the armor is sealed up good and tight," Ash chuckled as rainwater came drizzling out of his protective casing through the gap at his ankles. "Ash," said Janine, piping up quickly, a shiver running down her back. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," said the other trainer, instinctively looking to make eye contact with the girl but unable to see her in the dark. "What's up?" "Do you get the feeling something really big is going to happen?" she asked. "Or is it just me? I'd understand if you said I was getting riled up over nothing, but I just can't shake the idea that, well, that big changes are coming." Again, Ash tried to look for Janine, not sure how to take her sudden change in tone without a facial expression to read. "What brings this on all of a sudden?" he asked. "I don't know," said the girl in the hoodie, trying to stifle a shiver but still shaking against Ash a little. "But I was thinking about it the whole trip here. We're flying off to Cinnabar, to the middle of a war zone, to find someone who might already be dead by the time we get there but whose help we really, really need. There are people out there who know 1,000 times more about what's going on than either of us, but won't tell us anything because they don't have all the information. I keep trying to tell myself that it all makes sense, but..." She paused for a long second. "I don't know up from down anymore and I really don't like being in the dark." "You didn't want to say anything around Sabrina?" Ash guessed. He felt Janine shake and interpreted it as a nod. "I know how you feel. Actually." The young gym leader cleared his throat, his mouth beginning to feel clumsy as his heart rate picked up. "That's one reason I'm glad you decided to come with me." He paused but went on when Janine didn't say anything. "Tell you the truth, I was really worried you would go back to Fuchsia after you finished in Saffron, and I'd have to follow Team Rocket's trail on my own." At about that moment, Ash felt his chest growing tighter and his face getting hot. He couldn't understand exactly which aspect of the current situation set him so on edge, but his nerves buzzed and his hands shook. As his brain turned over and over, trying to interpret exactly why the girl next to him didn't answer, he realized he would have traded nearly anything to be able to see the look on her face. Ash nearly jumped, but managed to remain still when he felt warm fingers brush across the back of his hand, then slowly slip into his palm. "I'm right beside you," said Janine. "You can count on me." A great sigh of relief welled in Ash's chest, but he held it in until he could slowly release it, suddenly glad the darkness so completely masked his face as he took Janine's hand in his. "Thank you," Ash said. "Don't mention it," said Janine, scooting closer to Ash till their shoulders touched and she could lean her leg against his. "So, does this mean?" She trailed off. "I think I'd like it if it did," said Ash as the sound of the rain grew heavier. "I'm Ash Ketchum," Ash shouted, glaring down at the guard from Charizard's back as the man on the ground, dressed in the uniform of Pewter's gym, trained a crossbow straight at Ash's face. "You can put your weapon down." Charizard snarled through his teeth, wisps of smoke trailing from his nostrils and the edges of his mouth as the guard continued pointing the crossbow at Ash. The dragon's eyes flitted to the alleys between several of Pewter Town's squat buildings as more guards came running with weapons trained on Ash and Janine. "Sure you are," said the officer, not letting down his guard as his reinforcements arrived. You come flying over the wall on a Charizard like Lance himself, so if you expect us to roll out the red carpet, you're on drugs. Now get off your fucking dragon before I shoot you off it. Quickly scanning the wide pewter street, Ash surveyed his situation. He imagined that Charizard would have no trouble cutting down the 5 guards in front of him, but there were 3 to the dragons left who could fire before Charizard or Ash could react. Janine, he reasoned, who had stepped down from Pidgeot when the first guard came running, had shifted to a defensive posture, ready to bolt at the men threatening her at a second's notice. I'm only here to see Brock, Ash said, raising his hands as he tried to disarm the situation. You guys were a lot more hospitable on my last visit. He forced a grin. A stir in the line of men beside him caught Ash's attention. Weapons down! Shouted a young woman stepping through the rank. That's Ash Ketchum, men. He's on our side. Immediately Ash recognized her as Anna Satoshi, Brock's little sister and the gym member most frequently left in charge of the city whenever Brock traveled elsewhere. With a quick breath, Ash lowered his hands as the guards lowered their crossbows. Thanks for the rescue, Ash tried to sound amicable and polite. Turning to face a few of the guards, Anna pointed to Ash and Janine with her thumb. Don't threaten to perforate any gym leaders in the future, Captain, the young woman ordered, unless it's Kasumi of course. Ma'am, said the guard with a salute. Sorry ma'am. Perfectly understandable, Anna reassured the officer. Return to your patrols. She turned to Ash and, with a small grin, put a hand on her hip as the police officers dispersed. You certainly remember how to make an entrance, said the woman. Need something? Dusting himself down some, Ash stepped off Charizard and stood next to his mount as Janine stepped up next to him. I was hoping to meet with your brother, he said. I've got something I really need to tell him. Glancing over her shoulder, the few scattered rays of sunlight that made it through breaks in the clouds overhead making her tanned complexion seem almost pale, Anna shifted away from Ash a little. Sorry, she said. He's off with my brothers and most of the town's trainers and guards to Mount Moon. He left 2 days ago. Mount Moon. Ash started, his expression betraying his surprise. What's, oh shit? Kasumi? He asked. How'd you guess? Confirmed Anna. While we were in Fuchsia together, said Ash, your brother mentioned that there was a dispute over Mount Moon with Cerulean. Laughing once, a humorless sound, Anna nodded. The bitch in the bikini set up an operation on the mountain right before Brock got back from Celadon. She started tearing the terrain apart trying to scrounge up food and materials for Cerulean, normally not that big of a deal, but things have been tight for a while and the resources she started tapping into were our reserves. We sent an envoy of 5 people to talk and she sent back 2 very beaten up trainers to tell us to keep off her land. Matt, my little brother, didn't come back. So, Brock's on his way to shut her down. Mouth dropping open a little, Ash shook himself out of his surprise. Kasumi killed your brother? Brock's going to fight her? What all's happened in the last week? Brock's on his way, Anna began, to shut Kasumi down, she spoke each word clearly. Normally I'd hope my big brother would try to negotiate but this time's an exception. God, Ash muttered. I had no idea things were so bad. Shrugging and folding her arms, leaning away from the visitors, Anna looked between Ash and a silent Janine, then looked around the street as people began to slowly emerge from their homes. It's been difficult lately, she said. That's a blatant understatement, by the way. Anyway, you're always welcome, but Brock isn't here. Yeah, Ash stammered, leaving one hand on Charizard's neck. Sorry to cause a stir. Don't worry about it, said Anna. With Brock gone and the guards on full alert, not much doesn't cause some kind of stir. I'll be at the gym if you need anything. Feel free to stop by. Turning to Janine as Anna began to walk away, Ash stopped trying to force a pleasant expression and promptly grimaced. Well, he said. I didn't see that coming. Brock never struck me as the type to rush off on anything without thinking, said Janine. His profile always painted him as the defensive type. I guess the attack on his family set him off. That's got to be it, Ash thought aloud before looking back up at Janine. I just can't believe Kasumi would provoke him like that. She might as well beg him to retaliate. Maybe she is, Ash looked at the ground. I'll bet Kasumi expected to fight over Mount Moon sooner or later and she's goading Brock into attacking her so she can fight on her own terms, Janine said. That's exactly what I'd do in her place. Make my enemy tire himself getting to a location I already have well defended. She stopped as Ash frowned at the dirt. What do you think? Asked the girl in the black armor. Want to go after Brock and give him a hand? I don't know, said Ash. We're rushing as is. I know he's a friend, said Janine, but I don't think Cinnabar is going to wait. Brock has to know what he's doing. Ash looked up. Even if we knew exactly how to find him, there's no guarantee we'd be able to get there before any fighting started given the lead he's got on us. Cinnabar on the other hand. We already know where to go once we get there. Janine reached up and fiddled with the edge of her hood, bunched up as it was around her neck. I'll follow you either way, she said. That said, it's your call. Looking past her, Ash thought for a second. He patted Charizard just behind one of his scaly horns. Cinnabar it is, he said. We'll stop in Pallet along the way and hope for the best. Sounds like a plan. Janine turned as Pidgeot hopped up beside her. The girl swung her leg over the Pokemon's back and began lashing herself to the saddle as Ash climbed atop Charizard. Heaving and leaping into the air, the massive dragon jumped from the street, cutting thin lines into the cobblestone as he did, and pulled himself skywards with Pidgeot right at his tail. Ash and Janine circled the city twice as they gained altitude, both noticing now that dozens of armed men patrolled Pewter's streets and many more walked along its walls. Shaking his head and trying to process the revelation of Brock's situation, Ash angled Charizard south, away from the cloud-covered skies that seemed to blanket the north. Hey, Janine's voice buzzed in Ash's ear. What's up? Ash asked, pressing a finger to the little radio. I wouldn't worry about Brock, said the girl. He's had to have had time to plan this out. As much as I hate to admit it, Ash sighed, it's out of my hands. Seems like there's not much that isn't anymore. Hey, I know what will cheer you right up. Janine pulled up beside Ash and looked over at him. How about we go and pick up you grandfather, head down to Cinnabar, and kill the evilest son of a bitch we find? That sounds like fun. Ash laughed once and refocused his attention straight ahead. Yeah, he said, his voice more confident, it sure does. A few minutes' journey found the two trainers flying over the vast expanse of Viridian Forest. Ash shivered a little at the memory of his last visit to the wood. With no small amount of shock, he realized that the unbroken blanket of wilderness stretched from horizon to horizon, as far as he could see to both the east and west. After another several hours of uninterrupted flight, Ash and Janine came to the end of the forest beneath them and spotted Viridian City farther south. Scales glittering in the early morning sunlight, Charizard soared over the ruins of Pallet Town. Sitting on the dragon's back, Ash scanned the scene below with eyes sharp from a good night's rest. He looked between the streets where the signs of Oak's battle with the Red Gyarados could still be seen. Most of its buildings reduced to skeletons or piles of debris, Pallet had been slowly reclaimed by nature over the past months. There, Ash pointed to a large building by the coast, prompting Janine to follow the gesture. There's Grandpa's lab. He stared a second longer, but failed to make out any details from such height. Didn't you say it was destroyed in the fight? Asked Janine, gaze fixed on the ground. It looks like someone's rebuilt it. There's a person sitting outside. She exclaimed, pointing to the laboratory's entrance, I can't tell who though. Let's have a better look. Ash patted Charizard's side. Immediately the dragon began spiraling downwards through the clear air in wide circles, Pidgeot following behind. As they came closer to the ground and the details grew sharper, Ash saw plainly that the lab's walls, the ones on the first floor at least, had been rebuilt. Stronger and thicker windows lined the sides of the building, and a figure the size of an ant sat outside the main entrance. A blast of white announced the arrival of a Pokémon as the figure on the ground stood up and looked towards the sky. Ash motioned for Janine to follow, and directed Charizard to angle away from the lab. Touching down in the street a stone's throw from the laboratory, Ash waited until Janine landed beside him before directing Charizard forward. Her ornamented armor sparkling blue in the bright morning light, the woman outside the lab took a few steps to meet the new arrivals, her hand on the leathery hide of an enormous dragon at her side. Ash's mouth dropped open a little as he recognized the Pokémon. That's a Draco Knight. The young gym leader muttered, estimating the creature measured no less than 30 feet from its fanged muzzle to the tip of its bladed tail. Get ready to run. He turned quickly to Janine, just in case. Walking on legs thick as tree trunks, its low growl reverberating through the morning still, the dragon plodded on all fours beside its trainer, shaking the ground as it went. The woman's pale blue lips parted in a grin as she took the cigarette from her mouth and hissed out a long sheet of white smoke. Flicking the spent butt away and putting one hand on her hip, she faced Ash and rested the handle of her long spear against her shoulder. Well, she called out to Ash and Janine, wiping a wind-blown strand of blue hair from her face, the population of this sleepy little hamlet just doubled. His eye meeting the Dragonites, Ash climbed down from Charizard's back and strode forward, confident that the Pokémon meant him no harm. Ash Ketchum, said the trainer, holding out his hand. I'm Professor Oak's grandson. Is he here? Ah, toned the woman, taking Ash's hand and giving it a firm shake. The name's Claire. Nice to meet you. Lance's cousin? Ash asked, reflexively, now paying no mind to the Draco Knight. I thought I had seen your picture somewhere. It's an honor, but what are you doing in what's left of Pallet? Claire turned and nodded to the laboratory. Your grandfather came to the Elite Four to ask for help taking down Professor Elm. Lance owed the old man a favor, being his old student and all, and sent me along to make sure Elm's brought to justice. Oak's in there, just packing up the last of his things, he said. Finally. Ash laughed, looking up at the sky and drawing an uncertain glance from Claire. Finally a little luck. We're headed after Elm also. He gestured between the girl in the black armor and himself. What a coincidence, said Claire. Something like that, Ash said, his mind flitting to Mewtwo. I'll bet that clever bastard's been setting this up the whole time, Ash thought, amusedly to himself. He could have told me though. Don't like, Haunter floated silently out of Ash's pack as Claire pointed to the laboratory and told Ash to go in if he wanted. Feels like the mean psychic. Not the pretty one. Don't you dare pester her, Ash ordered the ghost as he began walking for the lab. We're going to need her help, and after all this shit I don't need you pissing off a heavily armed ally. Won't hurt, Haunter responded, floating back into Ash's pack. Won't trust, either. Janine right beside him, Ash returned Charizard and Pidgeot to their Pokeballs and pulled open the laboratory's door. Inside, the structure boasted plenty of light provided by numerous skylights and windows, though at a glance Ash could tell that each of the glass panes stood at least a foot thick, and those set in the ceilings sat reinforced and supported by steel bars. Grandpa! Ash called out, his voice carrying through the building and among the stacks of boxes and walls of equipment. It's Ash. Ash! Professor Oak's voice echoed from the other end of the structure. Ash! What are you doing here? No wait, never mind. Come back here. Ash smiled at Janine, touched her on the shoulder, and walked into the laboratory, picking his way between the machines, most of which he recognized as having been in the previous lab's basement when the Gyarados attacked. He came to an alcove near the back of the base, which ostensibly served as Oak's bedroom, given the comfortable furniture scattered about the small clearing. The professor, garbed in a suit of armor not dissimilar from Ash's or Janine's, stood up from lacing up his boot, and offered Ash a hand. Good to see you, said Oak as Ash bypassed the handshake and gave him a bear hug. He clapped his grandson on the back as the two stepped apart, and looked the young trainer over. You seem well. What are you doing here though? I could ask you the same thing, Ash said amicably, looking at his grandfather's choice of clothing and spotting the little stamp on the breastplate, an insignia identical to the Marsh badge. You headed off to a fight or something? Oak sighed and set his hands on a desk, leaning over the workbench and shaking his head a little. As a matter of fact, yes. I was just getting ready to reintroduce myself to an old associate. Mind if we tag along? Ash gestured to himself and Janine. I've got a score to settle with Elm, same as you. Oak turned around and looked his grandson in the eye. Ash nearly flinched at the intensity in the old man's eyes as Professor Oak's gaze went cold and the wrinkles across his forehead deepened. Sabrina told you then? Asked the professor. Ash nodded. She said it was Elm who attacked Pallet and destroyed the Viridian plantations. She said something about him going after Blaine, but the politics were a little over my head. I never should have assumed we were past all this, said Oak, folding his arms in front of his chest and leaning against the workbench. If you spoke with Sabrina, then she no doubt mentioned that my relations with the other professors were not always exactly civil. Legendary Shadow Wars, said Ash. That's what she called them. I hoped you might expound on that, actually. Well, muttered the professor. Talk about a long, string of most unpleasant events. The concise version is simple. Rowan, Birch, Elm, Bill, and myself were each professors researching Pokémon in our home countries. At first we knew nothing about each other, but when Bill and Rowan met in a random encounter, it kicked off events that lead to the five of us coming together to work together to better understand Pokemon and people alike. He stopped and glanced at Janine. Don't worry, said Ash. She's on our side. I've told Janine pretty much everything. Ash felt Haunter snicker. Not everything, chuckled the ghost. The professor and the girl in the black armor stared at each other for a second, though it was Oak who spoke first. Do you speak? Asked the professor. Janine smirked. Occasionally, she answered. When necessary. Anyway, Oak resumed, just because we all worked together didn't mean we didn't hate each other and try to steal the other's work. Elm and I especially took every opportunity to try and get the other killed. He stopped when he saw the surprise on Ash's face. You're not a child anymore, Ash. You can handle knowing that your grandfather wasn't always the harmless old dolt he's grown into. It wasn't too long ago that most of the people who knew me were more afraid of me than most gym leaders. So why now? Asked Ash. Why did Elm wait so long to make a move after spending so long in Johto? Or is this not the first time he's attacked you and I just missed it because I was too little at the time it happened? Glancing at the pack he had set by the workbench, Oak shrugged. This is the first move he's made in a long time. After a decade or two working together, you see, we professors eventually started to genuinely value each other's help. Most of us stopped fighting each other and started working together. Not so much. He broke away from the rest of us when we started cooperating, but he never missed an opportunity to steal our work or try to kill us. Janine set a hand on her hip. So why not kill him right back? We tried, said Oak. But Elm always stayed a step ahead. He always had backup plans and lackeys and a way of playing everyone off one another. More than once he almost managed to turn the Elite Four against me by setting me up to look like the bad guy. Which given some of my old work, admittedly, wasn't too hard. You're joking, Ash dropped his hands. How did he do that? He convinced some of my friends in Hoenn that I was conspiring to kill them for having worked with Elm in the past, Oak muttered, his face falling. At the same time, he arranged for me to find evidence that Norman, Caroline, and Professor Birch, my three friends, were conspiring with him to kill me. When I went to Hoenn to investigate, I found Elm and naturally attacked him while I thought he was off guard. Norman, Caroline, and Birch saw what I was doing, and they took it as proof that Elm told them the truth, and attacked me, which I took to be proof that they really were working with Elm. Wow, Ash toned, listening intently. They believed a liar like him. We were all bastards to some extent, Oak continued. I'm not surprised that even my friends could believe I would turn on them. So, when all was said and done, Elm was gone and the others were dead. Cliched as it might have been, I only found out about Elm's scheming when I happened across the letters he had been sending to Norman, which is why I'm almost positive Elm intended for me to find those letters. Naturally, I hurried off to the Elite Four to ask for them to intervene and help me deal with Elm. As it would turn out, the letters I took for evidence damn near pinned the murder of a gym leader on me, since Elm had gotten to the Elite Four first and told them I was going to try and pin the murders on him. All that saved me was Lance believing his former teacher over Elm. Ash, the professor stopped. I'm not telling you this to try and worry you, but because well, I might need your help. Absolutely, Ash nodded. I'll help however I can. Oak looked up at the sky through one of the barred glass panes. You need to understand that Elm won't go down easily. I guarantee you that he's playing the Jotuns off the Cinnabarines to draw me into an environment where he has some kind of advantage, but I'm also sure his plots run deeper than that. He's probably executing plans involving factions I don't even know exist, and he's spent years figuring out exactly how he wants this all to happen. So, you still want to go to Cinnabar? The older man smiled. Ash turned and faced Janine. I don't know, he said to the girl. What do you think? An evil genius on the loose, starting wars, reshaping the world just for his next move in a game of espionage that most people will never even know happened, Janine said, her lip curling into a grin. When do we leave? End of chapter.